Welcome to the Global Risk Podcast from Solace Global. This is your weekly global intelligence briefing, covering the key geopolitical and security developments shaping the world. This week in the Americas, we examine Ecuador's expanding curfew measures amid intensifying gang violence and the growing disruption caused by Bolivia's open-ended national strike. Across Europe, the Middle East and Africa, we look at planned nationwide disruption in Belgium linked to anti-austerity protests, the US withdrawal of troops from Germany amid tensions within NATO, and the collapse of Romania's government following a no-confidence vote. We also assess the risk of escalation in Ukraine around Russia's Victory Day commemorations, continuing unrest in Turkey, the fragile US-Iran ceasefire following renewed tensions in the Strait of Hormuz, Israeli strikes in Beirut, and rising anti-migrant violence in South Africa. And in Asia-Pacific, we cover the assassination of a prominent religious scholar in Pakistan and the disruption caused by renewed activity at Mayon Volcano in the Philippines. Expert insight, clear analysis, and the context you need, all in one concise briefing. We begin in the Americas, where Ecuador has imposed curfews across multiple provinces amid intensifying gang violence and expanding security operations. On April 28th, President Daniel Noboa signed Decree 370, imposing a curfew from May 3rd to May 18th, between 11 p.m. and 5 a.m., across 9 provinces and 4 cantons. During curfew hours, freedom of movement and the inviolability of the home and correspondence are suspended. This enables police and military forces to conduct raids without requiring warrants. Healthcare personnel, along with uniformed security and emergency response staff, remain authorized to move during the curfew period. The reason given for signing the decree was the rise in homicide rates. There were 2,509 killings in the first 4 months of 2026, with 1,098 of those in Guayas province alone. Quito's inclusion reportedly reflects what has been described as a critical scenario, in which Ecuador's largest gang, Los Choneros, and its splinter groups, Los Lobos and Los Tiguerones, are fighting for control of trafficking corridors. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. Ecuador has experienced a significant rise in gang-related violence since 2017, with estimates of gang membership ranging from 15 to 60,000. Since the emergence of major drug trafficking gangs, the violence has largely been confined to coastal regions. Approximately 80% of Ecuador's violence occurs in coastal provinces, reflecting their importance as transit hubs for cocaine shipments originating in Colombia and Peru. However, fragmentation within the gangs, combined with sustained state pressure, means these groups are extending their activity deeper inland. As a result, the previously relatively untouched capital, Quito, is becoming a battleground. Los Lobos, Ecuador's second-largest gang, emerged as an independent criminal group in 2021 and has reportedly established itself as the dominant criminal actor in Quito. Recent police operations have confirmed a significant Los Lobos presence. On October 29, 2025, 17 alleged members were arrested in Quito. A further 7 were detained in the capital on April 17, 2026. Reports from January 2024 also indicate that Quito's prison system is under Los Lobos' control, providing the group with a strategic operating base and a source of recruitment. There are several reasons why Quito is attractive to gangs. Certain sectors of the Quito Metropolitan District are particularly vulnerable to recruitment. These include Solander in the south, Quitumbe in the far south, Calderón in the north and northeast, and Comité del Pueblo in the northern urban area. High rates of unemployment and truancy, limited access to higher education, displacement from other provinces, and an influx of foreign migrants have all contributed to this vulnerability. Additionally, Quito sits on major road networks linking the capital to the coast, the Amazon, northern border areas, and the Central Highlands, making it strategically important. Curfews have been used by Noboa's government as part of its ongoing conflict with armed gangs. Previously, a curfew was imposed between March 15th and March 30th in Guayas, El Oro, Los Rios, and Santo Domingo de los Tzachilas. According to government statements, homicides fell nationally by 28% in March. A total of 1,283 people were detained following the curfew, which was accompanied by the deployment of 75,000 soldiers. However, the use of curfews has drawn criticism for the damage caused to local businesses. The Guayas Chamber of Commerce reported that 73% of businesses with nighttime activity recorded a 40% reduction in overall sales during the previous curfew. Venues primarily open at night reported losses of between 70 and 80%. Furthermore, the use of forceful security measures has not coincided with an overall reduction in violence, despite the high number of arrests. Since the declaration of an internal armed conflict in January 2024, President Noboa has repeatedly imposed states of emergency in high-violence areas. He has deployed the military alongside the police to conduct raids and mass arrests, and has also advocated the construction of a maximum security prison inspired by El Salvador's mega-prison model. Since September 2025, the United States has designated Los Choneros and Los Lobos as foreign terrorist organizations and specially designated global terrorists. It has also assisted Ecuador with military operations against the groups. While this approach has resulted in thousands of arrests of suspected gang members, it has almost certainly produced adverse second-order effects. Gangs have responded with greater violence, accelerating fragmentation, intensifying inter-gang conflict, and pushing further inland as they seek to evade state pressure and competition from rival splinter factions. The overall result has been a sharp year-on-year increase in homicides nationally, rising from 970 in 2017 to 9,216 in 2025. The curfew will highly likely coincide with intensified security operations in Quito, including attempted mass arrests of suspected gang members. This could increase the risk of violence in the immediate term. While the measure is likely to reduce nighttime street crime and restrict gang mobility in the short term, it is unlikely to materially degrade the gangs. It is also likely to trigger significant disruption to businesses. Also in the region, Bolivia's largest labor federation has launched an open-ended strike that is likely to result in major disruption and possible clashes with security forces. On May 1st, the Central Obrera Boliviana announced that it would begin an open-ended strike from May 5th. The declaration followed failed negotiations between union leaders and the right-wing government of President Rodrigo Paz, which had begun in March. The COB had demanded a series of concessions, including a 20% increase in the basic salary, the repeal of recent tax reforms, and pension increases. Paz, who leads the Christian Democratic Party, was elected in November 2025. He became Bolivia's first right-wing president after 2 decades of rule by the Movement for Socialism. Since taking office, Paz has implemented a series of austerity measures, including the removal of fuel subsidies. These steps have already provoked several waves of large-scale unrest. Following the announcement of the strike, several protest-related disruptions were recorded across Bolivia, as multiple unions and social organizations joined the nationwide action. On May 5th, roadblocks organized by striking transport sector workers were reported in La Paz, El Alto, Sucre, Cochabamba, Potosi, Montero, and multiple other locations. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. The first 6 months of Paz's presidency have been marked by repeated waves of protest and stagnating levels of public support. Paz likely secured victory in the presidential election due to the fragmentation of the Movement for Socialism, following the clash between Evo Morales and Luis Arce. However, in the March 2026 regional elections, his right-wing alliance, Alianza Patria, underperformed. It won only 2 of Bolivia's 9 departments, despite continued infighting and fragmentation within the left-wing Popular Front. Local commentators have observed that, while the collapse of MAS has created a political void that limits the potential for a coordinated nationwide challenge to the new government, it has strengthened smaller parties and labor unions at the local level. The persistence of the current protest wave is likely to reflect this dynamic. In addition to the recent setback in the local elections, Paz's position is almost certainly further weakened by the global fuel crisis linked to the Iran conflict. Bolivia depends heavily on imported fuel and fertilizer to meet domestic demand, leaving it exposed to the kind of price fluctuations observed since February 2026. The crisis comes after the government repealed fuel subsidy protections as part of broader efforts to reduce fiscal pressure. These measures have increased transport costs and have almost certainly been the primary factor mobilizing transport unions. In the short term, large-scale road blockades are likely to be implemented by protesters in an effort to coerce the central government into accepting their demands. This tactic has become well established among unions and other organizations in Bolivia. It has frequently resulted in violent confrontations with the police, leading to multiple casualties on both sides. Current roadblocks have been set up along main supply routes in and out of major cities, including key interdepartmental highways and access roads to La Paz, Cochabamba, and Santa Cruz. Blockades have also been reported in smaller population centers located at major highway junctions, including Potosí and Montero, as well as on approaches to the Peruvian border. This highly dispersed system of roadblocks is likely intended to maximize disruption while overstretching police clearance operations. However, if sustained, the government will likely be compelled to deploy additional police and military personnel to reopen key routes and protect critical supply corridors. That, in turn, would increase the risk of violence between protesters and the security forces. The nationwide roadblocks led by Evo Morales in 2024 lasted 17 days and resulted in fuel shortages, reduced exports, rising prices, and lost productivity. They were estimated to have cost around $2 billion. In response, the government deployed police and military forces on a large scale to reopen key transport corridors. This led to multiple violent clashes and fatalities on both sides. The current disruption has the capacity to be more severe. It is unfolding against the backdrop of an existing fuel crisis, heightened import dependency, elevated prices, and ongoing agricultural harvest cycles. As a result, prolonged blockades are more likely to generate acute shortages and intensified economic pressure. Now, turning to Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, where a planned nationwide transport strike in Belgium is expected to cause major disruption and could trigger wider protests. Belgian trade unions have announced a national demonstration on May 12th. The protest is directed against socio-economic reforms proposed by the federal government, including efforts to reform pension schemes and working conditions, as well as plans to cut the budgets of certain welfare programs. Although the demonstration is not formally a general strike, those taking part will reportedly be covered by strike pay. The planned nationwide demonstration has prompted an alert from the UK's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, which has warned of severe travel disruption across public transport networks, as well as potential knock-on effects on public services, including schools. A spokesperson for Brussels Airport has confirmed that approximately half of departing passenger flights are expected to be cancelled on May 12th. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. General strikes in Belgium were organised on March 31st, April 29th, October 14th, November 26th, and December 15th, 2025, and again on March 12th, 2026. They have become a recurring feature of opposition and trade union mobilization since Prime Minister Bart de Wever's new Flemish Alliance-led government assumed office in February 2025. The action has largely been driven by resistance to the government's austerity agenda, which is intended to reduce fiscal pressure and address Belgium's high public debt, estimated at around 103 to 107% of gross domestic product. Belgium's debt-to-GDP ratio exceeds the European Union's fiscal limit of 60%. As a result, the country has been placed under the EU's excessive deficit procedure, under the Stability and Growth Pact. This subjects Belgium to enhanced fiscal surveillance and obliges it to implement measures to reduce its debt burden. Many of these measures, including reductions in social welfare spending, pension reform, cuts to unemployment benefits, and reductions in the public sector, have proven widely unpopular across a large section of Belgian society, particularly within the trade union movement. However, given Belgium's fiscal position and its current obligations under the excessive deficit procedure, strikes and demonstrations have so far done little to alter the federal government's policy direction. Previous nationwide strikes have varied in both scale and levels of disruption. However, some, notably the strike in October 2025, attracted broad participation from transport unions and resulted in severe disruption. During the October 2025 action, operations at both Brussels and Charleroi airports were brought close to a standstill, as baggage handlers, security personnel, and other airport staff joined the nationwide strike. Major disruption was also reported at several of Belgium's key ports, and a number of principal routes into Brussels were blocked. Demonstrations were organized across the country, with significant disruption observed in Antwerp, Liège, Ghent, and Charleroi. The confirmation that participants will be covered by strike pay will almost certainly increase attendance, raising the likelihood of major disruption. Previous transport strikes and demonstrations have also triggered large-scale protests in urban centres, particularly in central Brussels, where opposition to De Wever and the new Flemish Alliance's Flemish nationalist stance is especially pronounced. Protests in Brussels have at times escalated into violence. Incidents have included clashes between demonstrators and police, vandalism, and the use of projectiles and pyrotechnics. There is a realistic possibility of disruptive protests and localized violence emerging on May 12th. Particularly if parallel anti-austerity demonstrations are organized to coincide with the transport action in an effort to maximize pressure on the federal government. Staying in the region, the United States has announced the withdrawal of 5,000 troops from Germany, highlighting growing tensions between NATO allies. On May 1st, the Pentagon confirmed that approximately 5,000 U.S. troops currently stationed in Germany would be withdrawn. The announcement was accompanied by the cancellation of a previously planned deployment of a battalion equipped with long-range missiles, first outlined during the administration of former President Joe Biden. The battalion had been expected to deploy with Tomahawk cruise missiles, SM-6 ballistic missiles, and the new long-range hypersonic weapon, also known as Dark Eagle. The decision by the current U.S. administration to withdraw the troops follows remarks by German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, who stated that the United States is being humiliated by Iran in the ongoing conflict, and that Washington has no strategy to bring it to an end. He also drew parallels with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. U.S. President Donald Trump dismissed Merz's comments, stating that the Chancellor should spend more time on ending the war between Russia and Ukraine. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. Germany hosts the largest contingent of U.S. troops in Europe, with around 35,000 American soldiers stationed in the country. In addition, there are approximately 13,000 U.S. Air Force personnel deployed across 20 facilities, most of them located in southern Germany. Ramstein Air Base in Rhineland-Palatinate is the largest U.S. military facility outside the United States. It serves as NATO's command center for airspace surveillance operations across the alliance's European members. The base in Stuttgart hosts the headquarters of U.S. European Command and U.S. Africa Command, while Wiesbaden serves as the headquarters for the U.S. Army in Europe and Africa. The United States also maintains approximately 20 B-61 thermonuclear gravity bombs at Buchel. During the Biden administration, Washington expanded its military footprint in Germany in response to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The planned deployment of long-range missile systems to Germany was almost certainly viewed in Washington as necessary to strengthen European deterrence. This was intended to counter both the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the expansion of Russian hybrid warfare targeting European NATO states. While the decision to withdraw forces was almost certainly influenced by Merz's comments, it also reflects broader U.S. efforts to reduce its military footprint in Europe. At the same time, Washington has been pressing European NATO members to increase their defense spending. The move also appears to employ more coercive measures in response to what the United States perceives as insufficient European support in key theaters, including the Gulf. On April 30th, U.S. President Donald Trump stated that he would probably consider withdrawing U.S. troops from Italy and Spain. Days earlier, international media reported that Pentagon officials had begun drafting options to punish European NATO members that had failed to support U.S. operations against Iran. The alleged plan, later dismissed by U.S. officials, included proposals to suspend Spain from the alliance or to review U.S. support for British sovereignty over the Falkland Islands. Taken together, these developments likely indicate that the Trump administration is increasingly willing to undermine collective defense arrangements and bilateral relationships in order to advance short-term objectives and compel allies to align with its strategic priorities. Also in Europe, Romania's government has collapsed following a no-confidence vote, increasing the likelihood of political instability and unrest. On May 5th, the Romanian parliament passed a censure motion that brought down the government of Prime Minister Ilie Bolojan of the centre-right National Liberal Party. The motion was backed by the opposition Alliance for the Union of Romanians, a far-right populist party, and secured the support of the Social Democrats. The Social Democrats had withdrawn from the governing coalition in late April over Bolojan's proposed budget spending cuts. Romania is next scheduled to hold parliamentary elections in 2028, and the country has never held an early parliamentary vote. However, recent elections have been marked by controversy. Most notably, the presidential election held in December 2024 saw its first round annulled following reports of alleged Russian interference in favor of the pro-Moscow candidate Călin Georgescu. The vote was rescheduled for May 2025, when the independent pro-European Union candidate Nicușor Dan defeated AUR leader George Simeon. Throughout the electoral process, several large-scale protests were organized across Romania. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. The no-confidence vote is almost certainly a decisive victory for AUR, which now stands as the principal opposition force in Romania. The alliance between the populist AUR and the largely establishment Social Democrats surprised many observers. It was reportedly not communicated in advance to the European Parliament's Socialists and Democrats group, of which the PSD is a member. There is a realistic possibility that the PSD's move is ultimately aimed at reshaping the governing coalition. This may rest on the assumption that President Dan will not call early elections, a scenario in which AUR would almost certainly significantly increase its share of parliamentary seats. In that context, the PSD may be seeking to re-enter government under a new prime minister positioned to the left of Bolojan. In the short term, the government crisis is likely to damage most ruling parties, particularly the PSD, while benefiting AUR. George Simeon and other AUR leaders have called for early elections. With the party currently polling at around 35%, compared with 21% for the PSD in second place, they are likely to intensify pressure on President Dan to call a vote. As a result, Romania faces an elevated threat of civil unrest in the near term, with protests likely in Bucharest and other major urban centers. In Ukraine, Russia has threatened major retaliation if Kyiv targets Victory Day commemorations during its continuing deep strike campaign. On May 4th, the Russian Ministry of Defense announced that, under instructions from President Vladimir Putin, it would observe a unilateral ceasefire from May 8th to May 9th to mark Russia's Victory Day. The occasion commemorates the 81st anniversary of the Soviet Union's victory over Nazi Germany. The ministry warned that any Ukrainian attempt to disrupt the event would result in a massive missile strike on the center of Kyiv. This follows an escalation in Ukraine's deep strike campaign in 2026. Between April 29th and May 1st, Ukrainian forces conducted strikes on oil infrastructure in Krasnodar Krai, Perm Krai, and Orenburg Oblast. The Tuapse refinery has reportedly been struck 4 times since April 1st. Ukraine has also claimed successful strikes against Russian combat aircraft at Shargol airfield in Chelyabinsk Oblast, approximately 1,676 kilometers from the international border. In response, President Volodymyr Zelensky announced that Ukraine would unilaterally observe a ceasefire from midnight on May 6th, contingent on Russian adherence. However, Russian forces continued their strikes. Overnight, they launched 108 one-way attack drones and decoys, along with 3 missiles. In the preceding 24 hours, Russian forces had also carried out numerous attacks, including the launch of 11 ballistic missiles and 164 one-way attack drones and decoys overnight between May 4th and May 5th. Strikes continued into the hours immediately before Ukraine's unilateral ceasefire was due to take effect. These attacks resulted in at least 22 deaths and more than 80 injuries, particularly following Russian glide bomb strikes on Kramatorsk, Zaporizhzhia, and Chernihiv. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. Ukraine's continuing deep strike campaign has reportedly reduced Russia's average refinery throughput to its lowest level since December 2009. It is almost certain that the Kremlin assesses the threat of significant disruption to its Victory Day commemorations as credible. Victory Day remains Russia's most important secular holiday. It is central to the Putin regime's military patriotic identity and to its broader projection of strength. Unlike in previous years, Russian authorities have announced that the 2026 Victory Day parade will proceed without armored vehicles or missile systems, citing the current operational situation. Such equipment has been displayed during earlier parades held amid the Russo-Ukrainian War. Its removal is likely to reflect concerns in Moscow that Ukraine's ability to target military equipment or other high-value targets during the event has improved. Any successful strike during or around Victory Day would almost certainly constitute a significant propaganda setback for the Kremlin, given the event's symbolic importance. By responding to Russia's unilateral ceasefire proposal with its own reciprocal offer, which Moscow subsequently ignored, Kyiv has likely shaped the conditions to justify potential strikes against Russia on Victory Day, despite Russia's initial ceasefire declaration. Given the importance of the event and the opportunity for a significant Ukrainian propaganda success, Russia has likely repositioned air defense systems to strengthen coverage around Moscow. However, the concentration of air defenses around the capital has likely created coverage gaps elsewhere in the country. This will likely present Ukraine with opportunities to exploit vulnerabilities in Russian air defenses, increasing the likelihood of strikes against high-value energy, military, logistics, and defense industrial targets beyond Moscow's enhanced protective umbrella. Overall, ceasefires since the full-scale invasion in 2022 have followed a similar pattern of failure. They have lacked clearly defined prohibitions, independent and credible monitoring, and meaningful penalties for non-compliance. The Orthodox Christmas truce in January 2023 was immediately contested. The March 2025 ceasefire on energy infrastructure targeting was marked by repeated mutual accusations of violations. The Easter truces in April 2025 and April 2026 likewise ended in reciprocal claims of breaches. In addition to the almost certain widespread violations, shaped by the absence of verification and enforcement mechanisms, these unmonitored ceasefires are almost certainly inherently vulnerable to information warfare. Given the explicit threat from the Russian military to strike central Kiev in response to any Ukrainian action on Victory Day, it is highly likely that Ukrainian deep strikes conducted on May 8 or May 9 would trigger escalated Russian retaliation. To signal that retaliation effectively, Russian forces would likely launch a large combined strike package targeting Kiev. They may also employ atypical weapon systems, such as the Oreshnik intermediate-range ballistic missile. That system has almost certainly previously been used by the Kremlin to signal deterrence and to influence Ukrainian decision-making. Meanwhile, in Turkey, further unrest is likely following large-scale May Day demonstrations and hundreds of arrests in Istanbul. Turkish police reportedly deployed tear gas and pepper spray, detaining more than 500 people after rallies held on May 1, International Workers' Day, in Istanbul's Taksim Square. The detentions were carried out under a ban on demonstrations in Taksim Square that has been in place since 2013. Other demonstrations were recorded across all major Turkish cities, including Ankara, Bursa, and Izmir. In the days leading up to May 1, a further 47 people were reportedly detained or placed under house arrest. On May 2, local trade unions stated that 576 individuals arrested during the demonstrations had been released. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. Large-scale protests are a recurring feature of political life in Turkey, and significant unrest in Istanbul has often led to episodes of violence and clashes between demonstrators and police. The most prominent drivers of protest are domestic. These include persistent socio-economic pressures, particularly high inflation, which has intensified the cost of living crisis, and the government's crackdown on the country's second-largest party, the Republican People's Party. In March 2025, CHP leader and mayor of Istanbul Ekrem İmamoğlu was detained on corruption and terrorism charges. Since then, weekly rallies have taken place in Istanbul, alongside several large-scale demonstrations attended by tens of thousands of participants. The decision to release most of those arrested on May 1 is likely a de-escalatory step by the Turkish authorities, intended to prevent further unrest in the immediate aftermath. However, additional large-scale demonstrations in Istanbul are likely in the short term. Unrest is highly likely on May 19, which marks the beginning of the 1919 to 1923 Turkish War of Independence. The day, commemorated as Ataturk Youth and Sports Day, holds particular significance for the Republican People's Party, which was founded by Ataturk. There is a realistic possibility that the occasion will be used by the CHP to organize anti-government rallies and to renew calls for İmamoğlu's release. Turning to the Gulf, the fragile US-Iran ceasefire has entered a temporary de-escalation phase after renewed tensions in the Strait of Hormuz brought the agreement close to collapse. On May 4th, Iranian forces launched 15 missiles and 4 attack drones against the United Arab Emirates. A drone strike injured 3 workers and caused a large fire at the Fujairah Petroleum Industrial Zone. These were the first attacks launched directly from Iran against the Gulf states since April 8, when the current ceasefire was implemented. Further attacks were recorded on May 5. Omani officials also reported that a building housing workers was damaged by an attack in the Tibat area of Bukhara, near the Emirati border. 2 expatriates sustained what were described as moderate injuries. However, given the proximity of the reported locations to the UAE border and Bukhara's position between Iran and Fujairah in the United Arab Emirates, it is possible that the projectile was not deliberately intended to strike Omani territory. The attacks followed an announcement on May 3rd by US President Donald Trump that American forces would guide third countries' ships safely out of the Strait of Hormuz under a new initiative known as Project Freedom. Iranian officials rejected the proposal, stating that all maritime transits through the strait must be coordinated with Tehran. On May 4th, several Iranian attacks against vessels in the Strait of Hormuz were reported, with at least one ship damaged near Al-Quwain in the United Arab Emirates. Between May 4th and May 5th, U.S. forces reportedly engaged and sank 7 Iranian fast attack craft after Iranian vessels attempted to strike U.S. Navy ships in the strait. U.S. Central Command denied Iranian claims that American vessels had been successfully hit. Iranian officials, in turn, asserted that the boats sunk by U.S. forces were civilian-operated. On May 5th, President Trump announced that Project Freedom would be suspended based on the request of Pakistan and other countries, and due to what he described as great progress towards a complete and final agreement with Iran. He added, however, that the blockade would remain in full force and effect. The Trump administration is reportedly engaged in negotiations with Tehran over a one-page, 14-point memorandum of understanding. According to U.S. briefings, the current draft includes a declaration formally ending the war, alongside the launch of a 30-day negotiation period, potentially to be held in Pakistan or Switzerland. Those talks would aim to reach a detailed agreement to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, impose limits on Iran's nuclear program, and lift U.S. sanctions. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. The continuing disputes over the Strait of Hormuz, which escalated sharply between May 3rd and May 5th, almost certainly raised the risk of a return to full-scale conflict, with the United States and Iran effectively in a stalemate. Washington almost certainly intends to use the blockade to pressure Tehran into making concessions on the nuclear file. This likely reflects an assessment that Iran has only limited remaining capacity to store oil before it would be forced to shut in production. Tehran, for its part, highly likely calculates that the United States cannot sustain a prolonged closure of the strait, given the significant economic and political costs such a disruption would entail. The Iranian strikes on the United Arab Emirates almost certainly constitute the most significant escalation since the ceasefire was implemented on April 8th. However, President Trump's immediate messaging stopped short of declaring that the ceasefire had been violated. The White House also stepped back from Project Freedom, which had likely served as the trigger for renewed Iranian strikes. Having come close to collapse, the fragile ceasefire has likely entered a temporary phase of de-escalation in the immediate term. Iranian officials neither confirmed nor denied responsibility for the strikes against the United Arab Emirates. However, Iranian state television broadcast a statement attributing the attacks to U.S. military adventurism. Meanwhile, anti-regime Iranian media reported that President Masoud Pezeshkian had expressed strong anger over the actions of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, reportedly describing them as completely irresponsible. The widely reported consolidation of power by hardliners within the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, with multiple sources indicating that Commander Major General Ahmed Vahidi is now effectively directing regime decision-making, almost certainly increases the risk of further escalatory action by Iranian forces. It also reduces the likelihood that Tehran can be compelled to make significant concessions, particularly those that could be perceived domestically as yielding to the United States. In addition to the overriding objective of regime survival in the face of the joint U.S.-Israel-launched war, the now likely IRGC-dominated leadership is also likely pursuing longer-term strategic aims, including greater control over the Strait of Hormuz. Such an objective would be highly likely to prove unacceptable to both the United States and the Gulf states. However, it is unlikely that the U.S. blockade will compel Tehran to make immediate concessions. Revised assessments of Iran's remaining oil storage capacity now extend into months rather than days, in part due to Tehran's ability to use tankers as floating storage. There remains a high risk of tactical miscalculation or escalation in the maritime domain, as US and Iranian blockade measures continue. Any retaliatory strikes would be unlikely to remain confined to the immediate area of engagement or to the maritime sphere alone. Disruption in the Strait of Hormuz represents Iran's primary source of leverage. Further US efforts to curtail that leverage are highly unlikely to go unanswered by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. However, initiatives such as Project Freedom have likely been constrained by limited regional backing. According to US briefings, Saudi Arabia has reportedly suspended the use of its territory for American military operations, reducing Washington's operational flexibility. The United Arab Emirates was highly likely selected as a target over other Gulf states for several reasons. Fujairah plays a critical role as an oil export terminal that bypasses the Strait of Hormuz, thereby reducing Iran's leverage derived from potential closure of the strait. The UAE is also reported to have developed an increasingly close security partnership with Israel. In addition, its withdrawal from OPEC and growing rivalry with Saudi Arabia may have contributed to its relative isolation within the Gulf. Tehran likely calculates that the UAE is now the most hostile Gulf state towards Iran. Targeting it may therefore serve a dual purpose: signaling resolve, while also attempting to further isolate Abu Dhabi from the rest of the Gulf Cooperation Council. If the current diplomatic track collapses, Washington may ultimately conclude that a return to military action is the only remaining means of compelling compliance from Tehran. Should the United States resume strikes in an effort to break the deadlock, this would highly likely trigger renewed full-scale Iranian attacks across the Middle East. Such retaliation would likely involve an expansion of Iranian targeting priorities. In particular, Tehran could seek to strike assets and infrastructure that allow Gulf states to export oil and gas while bypassing the Strait of Hormuz. This could include pipelines to Saudi Arabia's Red Sea port of Yanbu, as well as the Emirati port of Fujairah. Iran has repeatedly stated that its forces are ready to resume full-scale attacks. The military has highly likely used the ceasefire period to strengthen both its offensive and defensive posture. There are also reports that Iranian forces have repositioned transporter Erector launchers beyond the range of certain US long-range strike systems. Moving these assets deeper into Iranian territory may reduce the proportion of the ballistic missile force capable of reaching Israeli targets. That shift could increase the likelihood that, if full-scale conflict resumes, these systems are instead directed against the Gulf states. Also in the region, Israel has conducted its first strike in Beirut since the implementation of the current ceasefire. On May 6th, the Israeli Air Force carried out strikes in the southern suburbs of Beirut, known as Dahiyeh. The attack resulted in the death of Malik Balut and several other Hezbollah members. Balut was reportedly the commander of Hezbollah's Radwan force and had led the unit since 2024, following the death of its former commander. The strike was personally approved by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. It marks the first time Israel has conducted an attack in Beirut since the ceasefire came into effect on April 16th. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. The Radwan force is an elite special operations unit within Hezbollah. It is responsible for infiltration operations into Israel, particularly in the Galilee region and parts of northern Israel, and has also been involved in the abduction of Israeli citizens. The unit was initially established in 2006, during the 2006 Lebanon War, under the name Intervention Unit. Since then, it has received significant external support from Iran and maintains a deeply embedded relationship with Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, particularly the elite Quds Force, which oversees Iran's extraterritorial operations. The fact that the strike was personally approved by Netanyahu and that the US was reportedly briefed in advance likely underscores the strategic importance Israel places on degrading the Radwan force. Hezbollah still retains the ability to conduct attacks into northern Israel and to leverage unconventional tactics to inflict casualties on the Israel Defense Forces. The unit is also used by Iran to project strength in Israel's near abroad. The need for Netanyahu's authorization and prior notification to the US likely reflects Israel's recognition that strikes conducted under the current ceasefire, particularly those not confined to southern Lebanon and especially in Beirut, have the potential to undermine the wider ceasefire agreement between the US and Iran. Iranian interpretations of the ceasefire terms extend to Lebanon. However, the incident almost certainly demonstrates that Israel remains willing to carry out strikes against targets of opportunity in Beirut, should they be assessed as sufficiently high value. Despite its degradation, Hezbollah is likely to respond to the killing of a senior commander in the southern suburbs of Beirut during ceasefire conditions by increasing attacks on IDF frontline positions, as well as rocket missile and drone strikes into northern Israel in the short term. However, the recent strike in Beirut, followed by heightened Hezbollah activity, is likely to undermine the current ceasefire and place additional pressure on the Lebanese government to accelerate efforts to disarm and constrain the militant group. And in South Africa, anti-migrant demonstrations and targeted violence are likely to increase amid worsening economic pressures. On May 3rd, Nigeria's Foreign Minister Bianca Odumegwu Ojukwu stated that at least 130 Nigerian citizens in South Africa have requested repatriation following escalating protests. That number is expected to rise. The repatriation requests follow several incidents of violence against Nigerian nationals. One Nigerian citizen died from injuries sustained after being beaten by South African National Defense Force personnel on April 20th. Another citizen was reportedly apprehended on April 19th following an altercation with Tshwane Metro Police. His body was later found at Pretoria Central Mortuary. Nigerian officials have demanded a full investigation into both incidents and have called on South African authorities to release the autopsy reports, case files, and other relevant documentation. In addition, 4 Ethiopian nationals have been killed in recent weeks. Concerns about a spike in anti-migrant violence have not been raised by Nigerian nationals alone. Authorities in Ghana have also noted reports of Ghanaian citizens being confronted by vigilante groups. The United Nations has likewise expressed concern over reports of xenophobic attacks, as well as acts of harassment and intimidation targeting migrants and foreign nationals in South Africa. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. The rising violence against foreign nationals has coincided with an increase in anti-immigration protests. The most recent demonstration took place on April 29th when hundreds marched in Johannesburg against illegal immigration. The protest was reportedly organized by March and March, with support from the anti-migrant groups Operation Dudula, Action SA, and the Patriotic Alliance. The rise of dedicated anti-migrant groups likely reflects the increasing organization of anti-migrant movements in South Africa in recent years. Since 2022, Operation Dudula, meaning to push, has reportedly harassed immigrant traders in Soweto and Johannesburg. At the same time, the Dudula movement emerged as a vigilante organization targeting foreign nationals believed to be undocumented. March and March, a self-described grassroots citizen movement addressing growing concerns about undocumented immigration in South Africa, is a newer organization seeking to mobilize citizens through what it describes as peaceful demonstrations and rallies. Videos shared online appear to show vigilante groups attacking individuals they believed were in South Africa illegally. On March 30th, an anti-migration march in the Eastern Cape followed the installation of a Nigerian national as an Igbo traditional leader, or king. The protest resulted in the torching of minibus taxis and damage to public infrastructure. During these demonstrations, many businesses have been forced to close, including both locally owned and migrant-owned premises, amid fears of looting and vandalism. Migrants account for just under 4% of South Africa's population, equivalent to approximately 2.4 million people. Most originate from neighboring countries, including Lesotho, Zimbabwe, and Mozambique. Anti-migrant groups claim that there are between 3 and 5 million undocumented migrants in the country, although these figures are contested. A primary driver of anti-migrant sentiment is South Africa's high unemployment rate, which remains above 30%. Anti-migrant groups have mobilized this issue to frame migrants as direct competitors for jobs, housing, informal trading space, and access to state resources. Recent demonstrations have centered on demands for tougher immigration enforcement, increased deportations, and the exclusion of undocumented migrants from jobs and public services. These tensions have highly likely been exacerbated by rising economic instability following the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. On May 6th, petrol prices increased by approximately $0.2 per litre, while diesel rose by $0.38 per litre, among the largest price adjustments in recent history. Amid a rising cost of living and the growing prominence of anti-migrant pressure groups, further demonstrations are highly likely across major cities such as Johannesburg and Pretoria, as well as in the provinces of KwaZulu-Natal and the Eastern Cape. Further targeted vigilante violence against foreign nationals is also highly likely, particularly where individuals are suspected of being irregular migrants or belong to nationalities associated with large migrant communities in South Africa. Now, shifting to Asia-Pacific, the assassination of a prominent religious scholar in Pakistan has likely formed part of a broader Islamic State-linked campaign targeting influential figures. On May 5th, several gunmen opened fire on a vehicle in Chausadha district in Pakistan's Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province. The attack killed Sheikh Muhammad Idris Turangzai, a prominent religious scholar affiliated with Jamiat Ulema-e-Islam, or JUIF, the largest Deobandi Islamist party in Pakistan, which has more than 4 million members. 2 police officers were also injured in the attack. Pakistani authorities have launched a joint investigation involving the Counter-Terrorism Department and district police. The 4 alleged gunmen have not been detained. However, officials state they have possibly identified a suspect affiliated with a banned organization. Channels associated with Islamic State Khorasan province, the main branch of Islamic State in Afghanistan and Pakistan, celebrated the killing and claimed responsibility. The attack was condemned not only by Pakistani officials, but also by representatives of both the Afghan and Pakistani Taliban. Jamiat Ulema-e-Islam has since announced plans for widespread protests across Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. The killing of Muhammad Idris is particularly notable given the victim's profile as one of the most prominent religious scholars in Pakistan, as well as his political significance through Jamiat Ulema-e-Islam. Islamic State channels have historically targeted the party and its representatives on ideological grounds. Although JUIF promotes a conservative religious platform and advocates for the broader implementation of Islamic law in Pakistan, its participation in the democratic process is regarded by Islamic State as a form of apostasy. The decision to target Idris was likely also influenced by what could be described as diplomatic considerations. Idris was an ethnic Pashtun, and his Deobandi school holds significant prominence in Afghanistan. As a result, he had thousands of students on both sides of the border, including Taliban officials. Local observers have noted that his standing in both countries could have been leveraged to facilitate bilateral meetings, a notable advantage given the ongoing tensions between Pakistan and Afghanistan. In recent years, several prominent religious scholars have been assassinated in Pakistan. In March 2025, Munir Shakir, the founder of the Deobandi militant group Lashkar-e-Islam, was killed by an improvised explosive device detonated outside a mosque in Peshawar. A month earlier, Hamid-ul-Haq Haqqani, a religious scholar and head of the influential Darul Uloom Haqqaniya Seminary, was killed in a suicide bombing near Peshawar. In both cases, Islamic State Khorasan province was identified as likely responsible. Against this backdrop, the assassination of Idris appears to form part of a broader ISKP campaign targeting Islamist scholars in Pakistan. And finally, in the Philippines, renewed activity at Mayon Volcano is continuing to cause widespread disruption across parts of Luzon. On the evening of May 2nd, a major pyroclastic flow was recorded on the southwestern slopes of Mayon Volcano in Albay province in the Bicol region of Luzon. The flow had an estimated run-out distance of 4 kilometers and generated a substantial ash cloud, which affected dozens of nearby towns. Ashfall has continued to be recorded as of May 7th. The eruption was accompanied by several earthquakes. Between May 5th and May 6th, the Philippine Institute of Volcanology and Seismology recorded 11 volcanic earthquakes, including 3 tremors lasting between 3 and 6 minutes. Filipino authorities have declared a state of calamity in several parts of Albay province due to the severe impact of the pyroclastic flow. Around 200,000 people have been directly affected by the eruption, with thousands displaced. Local media report widespread traffic disruption near the volcano, as heavy ashfall has significantly reduced visibility and caused severe congestion. At least 2 flights between Manila and Daraga have been cancelled, affecting approximately 230 passengers. Now our intelligence team's assessment. Mayon Volcano has exhibited heightened activity for several months. In early January, the Philippine Institute of Volcanology and Seismology raised the alert level following intensified activity, including repeated rockfall events. Later that month, authorities declared a state of calamity in Tabaco City due to the continuing volcanic unrest. The increased volcanic activity is likely to have an adverse impact on the local economy and infrastructure. On May 6th, authorities assessed that the eruption had already caused more than 6.6 million Philippine pesos in agricultural damage across Albay. Crops in Camalig, Ginobatan, and Daraga have been particularly heavily affected. Local media, citing the Philippine Space Agency, reported that at least 21,000 acres in Albay have been impacted by ashfall from Mayon. While no deaths have been reported, ashfall continues to pose a significant health risk. Authorities note that ash can be particularly hazardous for individuals with pre-existing conditions. However, prolonged exposure can also lead to lung damage in otherwise healthy people. In addition, dispersed ash may contaminate water sources or damage water supply infrastructure, creating longer-term public health risks. Localized disruption is likely to continue in the immediate term and may begin to subside in the coming weeks, provided no further volcanic activity is recorded. However, sustained high levels of activity, including additional large pyroclastic flows or seismic events, could further exacerbate infrastructure damage and prolong travel disruption across Luzon. That concludes this week's Global Intelligence Briefing. These updates are part of our Global Intelligence subscription, which includes weekly reports, in-depth briefings, and live Q&A sessions with our experts. To learn more, visit solaceglobal.com. Thank you for listening.